I would like to warmly welcome you all to this two-day conference on populism and religion, the American case. The conference is co-sponsored by IRCPL, the Institute for Religion, Culture and Public Life, the Department of Political Science, and fairly obviously the School of Journalism. It's the first in a series of conferences that are part of the Religion and the Rise of Populism's Difference, Dissent, and Tolerance project, funded by the President's Global Innovation Fund at Columbia University, a project that was formulated by Catherine Ewing, who is here somewhere. There she is. There's that awful light. I wish we could take that light off. Could we turn off that light that's in my eyes? She's the acting head of IRCPL, and with input from myself and several other faculty at Columbia. Indeed, I'd like to thank my co-organizer, who's not here for reasons that don't matter. Alexander Stilla, he will be here later, from the Journalism School, and for his good work in putting together the media panel and the plenary. I thank the Journalism School for letting us use this room. And then I'm grateful, obviously, for the work by Walid Hammam and Trezine Nichols from the Institute, all the organizational work, which was very helpful. So, everybody seems to be writing on populism these days. Given the global rise of populist movements, parties, and leaders, this is unsurprising. But the relationship of populism to religion has been understudied. And today and tomorrow, we want to focus on the American case. While it may be distinctive in certain key respects, America is no longer exceptional in linking populist and religious discourse, tropes, and justifications. Given its long history with this conundrum, we think it's instructive to focus on American populism, past and present, to understand its distinctive features and in what way it has been and is a harbinger of what's emerging elsewhere. Now, the relation between populism and religion is complex, and in some ways counterintuitive. Elsewhere, in a joint piece with Andrew Arado, I argue that it's obvious that populists do hijack religion for their own purposes and vice versa. Savvy religious entrepreneurs also instrumentalize populist identity politics to further their own agendas, but they're strange bedfellows. Modern populist movements are a secular phenomenon, while religious ones obviously are not. There are indeed both tensions and affinities between populist logic and religion. In order to be able to understand this, I'm going to put forth, and I know it will be controversial, which is good, a working definition, or rather an ideal type of populism. Don't worry, I won't attempt that with religion. One that would be controversial but could help us get a handle on the relationship between populist identity politics and religion. So, full disclosure, I think that populist identity politics, whether or not they are framed as being right or left, indeed populism blurs those distinctions. I think that these politics pose serious challenges, you turned it on again, to pluralistic civil societies and constitutional democracies. In my view, the stakes and risks are high, and they include the deconsolidation and even loss of constitutional democracy, even though populist leaders today gain power through elections and don't block future elections, although they do tend to undermine the norms, compromise tolerance, legitimacy of the opposition, minority rights, free press, free competition, that make elections genuine and democracy work. We can discuss and debate this over the next days, but here I want to just give you the concept, and then we'll move to the panel. So populism is ambiguously, conceptually, and ambivalent politically because it's not associated, it doesn't entail a substantive ideology, a clear collective identity, or a single social strata. Populism entails a discourse that pits the people against the elites, invoking the people's sovereignty, and aims to restore it by capturing it from the establishment. It involves a style entailing the performative embodiment of the habitus of ordinary folk by political leaders, including the use of vernacular speech, bad manners, postures, and dress to facilitate identification with the so-called common man. It also entails, and this is important for us, a thin ideology that separates the authentic people from the corrupt elite and from alien elements in the population who the elite supposedly wrongly coddles. This is important because populist ideology is indeterminate enough that it can link up with thicker host ideologies: nationalism, racism, fascism, communism, and religion. and or all. But populism also crucially entails a fourfold political logic that involves the following: a pars pro toto dynamic through which a composite substantive part of the population, substantive, stands for the whole, an imaginary of the democratic sovereign people as one, a unitary collective body, a vision of the true people as morally pure, but to restore their voice, status, influence, and power. A frontier of antagonism has to be drawn between them and others who allegedly contaminate the people, and thus it entails a friend-enemy version of identity politics, construing competitors as enemies. Finally, populism involves an embodiment model of representation wherein a leader emerges, typically, not always, who incarnates the unity and oneness of the people and its identity. Once in power, populists tend to delegitimate all opposition in political society and critique in civil society, and challenge the facts uncovered by credentialed journalists and other analysts as fake news if they go against their agenda. This is the case because within populist logic and the imaginary of populism, compromise with the competitor isn't really possible because they're enemies. That's why populism, in my view, is anti-pluralist and anti-democratic intrinsically, even though it uses democratic means, supposedly. So it's clear that populist discourse of restoration, redemption, impending doom, existential crises, Manichaean and millennial tropes borrows from religion. But it's also clear that religious identity has become part of the way to name the authentic people and to exclude the inauthentic, although how religious this identity really is remains for us to see and to discuss. So that's the problematic behind the conference, and let me turn to introducing our panel. The opening panel on populism and religion in America, historical perspectives and contemporary logics, we would thought of it as considering the various forms of American populism and the intersection of populist and religious rhetoric in relationship to religious activists and politics. So our speakers are, I guess this is the order. Where is the order? Jose Casanova, who's sitting in the middle. He is the professor of sociology, theology, and senior fellow at the Berkeley School for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. I'm not going to list the full bios here. First of all, you have them and they're too long. I think that he's the author of the very famous Public Religions in the Modern World, and most recently, is this a co-edited book, Islam, Gender, and Democracy?
Yes.
And so he's the co-editor of the book, Islam, Gender, and Democracy. Rhys Williams is professor of sociology at Loyola University, where he's also director of the McNamara Center for the Study of Religion. And his most recent book is, what is your most recent book?
I happen to have it right here.
Oh, great, that's great. Here it is, Religion and Progressive Activism. Excellent. New stories about faith and politics. Wonderful. And then Roger Smith is the Christopher Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Associate Dean for the Social Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, and now the acting president of APSA, American Political Science Association. And his most recent book is?
Political Peoplehood.
Yes, okay. That's what I thought, but I wasn't sure. I was afraid you might have snuck out another one, Political Peoplehood. So let's start with Jose Casanova. Okay.
Let's go there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot something. I'm Professor Jean Cohen from Columbia University, Department of Political Science. My most recent book is Forms of Pluralism and Democratic Constitutionalism. It's an edited volume forthcoming in 2018 at Columbia University Press. That's all.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction, Jean, and for the conceptual framing of, I think, nothing to criticize about the very, very precise and very clear definition of populism. The title of my talk is The Entanglement of Race, Language, and Religion in American Populist Nativism. So I'm going to focus on American nativism. There have been populisms that have been more socioeconomic, that have not had as much a nativism. I mean, you could say the end of the 19th century. But there is a long tradition of American nativism that links precisely religion and anti-immigration. And I think that this is the context which is important for our contemporary situation. Nativism always entails a dual process of naturalization of some group as the native majority and the denaturalization of some other group as the alien minority. The American case clearly shows that there is nothing natural about the original social construction of WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, as the Native American people, to the exclusion of Native Americans and African Americans. But the acronym white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, namely one race, language, and religion, accurately points to the three composite elements, race, language, and religion, which through shifting entanglements have structured American nativism throughout history. At first, one could say race served originally as the primary criterion for the construction of American nativism, as is evident from Tocqueville's discussion of native savages and black slaves in Democracy in America, in the final chapter of the first volume as a postscript on the three races in the United States. It is not the case that Tocqueville is insensitive to the fate of both groups. On the contrary, Tocqueville's almost clinically detached analysis remains one of the most damning portrayals of American racism and of the genocidal violence inflicted upon both groups by liberal democracy. But he conveniently justifies the separate treatment of the subject matter at the end of the book by arguing that both discriminated races inhabited the territory but were not part of democracy in America. They're not part of we the people, we the American people. They are in America, but they're not part of the we the people. So the fact that Native Americans and African Americans could not be part of American democracy disqualified them from belonging to the natural majority, while new white Protestant European immigrants could be immediately naturalized and become culturally the real natives. Originally, therefore, American nativism had not been structured through religious identities and was not directed against Catholics yet. It is true that there was violent anti-popery and anti-papism throughout the colonial period, but then there is a phase through the independence in which anti-Catholicism and anti-popism, anti-popery discourse very much weakens, partly because there was a Catholic Republican elite, the Carrolls, co-signers of the Declaration of Independence, John Carroll, the first bishop, founder of the first Catholic university, Georgetown in the United States, and there is a moment in which this Republican Catholic minority can be incorporated into we the people. But by the 1840s, with the massive immigration of Irish Catholics, the situation changed. And it is then when you have the renewed Protestant crusade to Christianize the Republic, which emerged out of the Second Great Awakening. In his famous classic study of the Protestant Crusade, Ray Allen Billington singles out 1830 as the year in which anti-Catholic Protestant nativism emerged into the public sphere. It was the year in which the Protestant, the journal, the first openly anti-Catholic newspaper, was published in New York. It was also the year in which the Reverend Lyman Beecher, president of Yale and founder of the New School of New England Calvinism, began his series of anti-Catholic sermons linking Catholicism and despotism as threats to the Christian Republic. In one of his sermons, while visiting Boston in 1834, he warned, the Catholic Church holds now in darkness and bondage nearly half of the civilized world. It is the most skillful, powerful, dreadful system of corruption to those who wield it, and of slavery and debasement to those who live under it. Soon thereafter, a Protestant mob burned the Ursuline Convent School of Charlestown, Massachusetts. But the fusion of theological anti-Catholicism and populism, anti-immigrant nativism, first took place in the 1840s with the massive arrival of Irish immigrants. Immigrants from Catholic countries, whether religious or not, became now, for the first time, clearly distinguishable by class and ethnicity from their fellow American citizens, and thus could become also embodied representations of dreaded Catholicism. The Reverend Horace Bushnell, the leading American liberal theologian, warned Protestant America, "Our first danger is barbarism, Romanism next." He could have added, "Both happen to be Irish." Unlike Scottish Irish Protestants, who form a majority of WASP in the South, Irish Catholics, despite the whiteness of their skin and their English linguistic competence, could not pass as WASP. They were barbarian Celtic that had been part of the confrontation between the British colonizing of Ireland. And so you know all the literature about how the Irish became white. The question here is precisely the Irish could not pass as Anglo-Saxon, partly because they were Catholics, but also because they were precisely Celtic in the conflict with Anglo-Saxons in Ireland. Let's not forget that the first Ku Klux Klan, when it emerged, was not directed against blacks, it was directed against Catholic and Mormons. It was the anti-Romanism and anti-Mormonism that were the two key nativist discourse in the emergence of nativism in the 1840s, 1850s, and into the 60s. The first, the formation of the American Republican Party in the 1840s, then the Know Nothing movement. The Know Nothing movement, which basically was organized as an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant party. Let me just... On May 3rd, 1844, the Irish Industrial District of Kensington went up in flames, following American Republican Party rally in Philadelphia. On 6 August 1855 in Louisville, Kentucky, Election Day turned into Bloody Monday after the Louisville Journal had incited the Know-Nothings to put down an organization of Jesuit bishops, priests, and other papists. A few weeks later, Abraham Lincoln warned that if the Know-Nothings come to power and enter the White House, and they were very close to win the elections then, the Declaration of Independence would read, "All men are created equal, except Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics." Now, this anti-nativism changed, obviously, after, with the second Ku Klux Klan, you see clearly the fusion of anti-black racism with renewed anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. And then, of course, you have the great Protestant coalition that led to prohibition in the 1920s. This was the great moral Protestant crusade. In some of my writings, I have argued that American Protestantism has gone through three disestablishments. The first disestablishment of the secular state, the secularization of a state, disestablishment of the Protestant churches that led to religious pluralism. The second disestablishment, the secularization of the American university, roughly in the 1880s, 1890s, that led to the secularization of intellectual cultural pluralism, to add to it, obviously, the public sphere, media, Hollywood, etc. But the Protestant ethic remained, and even the Catholics and Jews that became part of the American civil religion in the 50s, basically were integrated into the American way of life, into the Protestant ethic. The third disestablishment is precisely in the 60s, following the civil rights movement, the gender revolution, and it has to do now with the secularization of ethics itself, of morality, and moral pluralism. It is this third disestablishment that led, of course, again, every disestablishment, the first, the second, the third, led to the emergence of a fundamentalist Protestant crusade. In the first, then in the second, what we know as fundamentalism comes out of the second disestablishment, and then the third leads to the foundation of the moral majority in 1979, an attempt again to create this new culture war between conservatives and liberals that has continued until the present. As you know, Bella put the argument of the American civil religion as this type of discursive structure, legitimation of who belongs, who basically participates to a certain extent in with the people, and it is through the inaugural addresses of presidents that Bella traces the transformation of American civil religion from Washington through Jackson, through Lincoln, and then through Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson. We could even point how Reagan himself acknowledges the role of the civil rights movement in getting over the racism of the past. We could get into the Bush inaugural address, how he includes Islam into addition to church, synagogue, mosque is added, and how in addition to the truths of the Sinai and the gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, he adds the Quran. So kind of an Abrahamic new civil religion was taking place. But it is really in the inaugural addresses of Obama that we can really see the transformation of American civil religion that was lead to the radical transformation of American society that comes out of what we argue the civil rights movement, the gender revolution, but also the massive immigration. Let's not forget that roughly from the transformation of the new immigration law till the present, over 40 million immigrants have entered the United States, although they are particularly concentrated, almost 70% of them in 7 states, basically the Northeast, the West, and Mid-States. Basically now they also have been growing in every other state. And it is, let me just read. The first inaugural address reiterated that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. Notice the emphasis on equality, not only freedom. Equality has practically disappeared from the American discourse. There is only liberty, freedom on both sides is basically the argument. Equality very, very rarely emerges really in the cultural wars. And stressing that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness, President Obama went on to redefine the national civil religion by affirming that we are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. Expanding beyond the conception of an Abrahamic nation to include for the first time in the inaugural address not only Hindus as representatives of a non-monotheistic world religion, but even more significantly non-believers, thus acknowledging all those without religious denomination who in fact represent the fastest growing sector of our self-denominational secular religious market. In a self-referential indication of the crucial transformation brought by the confluence of the civil rights movement, the feminist gender revolution, and the immigrant demographic transformation, and to the new majority coalition that elected him, President Obama added, "This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall, and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served in a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath." The second inaugural address made the themes of gender and racial expansion of the National Covenant even more explicit by stating that, quote, "We are true to our creed when a little girl born into the bleakest poverty knows that she has the same chance to succeed as anybody else because she's an American, she is free, and she's equal, not just in the eyes of God, but also in our own." President Obama then went on to expand the definition, "we the people," by declaring that the most evident of truths, that all of us are created equal, is the star that guards us still, just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls, and Selma, and Stonewall, just as it guided all those men and women, sung and unsung, who left footprints along this great mall to hear a king proclaim that our individual freedom is inextricably bound to the freedom of every soul, and earth. And he continued, for our journey is not complete until our wives, our mothers and daughters can earn a living equal to their efforts. Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. Our journey is not complete until we find a better way to welcome the striving, hopeful immigrants who still see America as a land of opportunity. One could perhaps think that inaugural addresses are just words, or even more cynically, that Obama's words were just an acknowledgement of the new moral majority made up of young people, women, racial and religious minorities, and new immigrants who had re-elected him. I happen to believe that Bella was basically right when he argued that presidential inaugural addresses were expressions and manifestations of the continuous reformulation of an American civil religion, and that irrespective of the way in which history might judge the achievements and failures of the Obama presidency, his inaugural addresses point clearly in the direction of the new national moral consensus, redefining the American civil religion. Now, what is, of course, striking about Trump is the fact that although it would be difficult to find any religious trace in Trump's persona before his run for the US presidency, Trump did appeal and has maintains an appeal to American evangelicals with his anti-Obama and anti-Clinton rhetoric and with promise to nominate conservative judges. Evangelicals have proved also much more receptive to the new Russian discourse in defense of traditional Christian values and the attempt of the Moscow Patriarchate to lead an international moral majority throughout Europe, precisely against the liberal values of the European Union, the secularism and gay rights that the European Union represent also in the discourse of Putin. So Trump's inaugural address was actually devoid of any of the traditional American civil religion tropes. But Trump's obsession to undo everything that the Obama presidency represented becomes more intelligible as a WASP, racist, nativist backlash. I've written elsewhere about the intertwinedness of race. Trump was the first public voice to bring together his dual advocacy of a Muslim ban and a Mexican wall. Even Samuel Huntington, the author who may have contributed the most to the discourse of a clash of civilizations between Islam and the West, failed to even mention Islam or Muslim immigrants in his American Nativist Manifesto, Who Are We? The Challenges of America's National Identity. It is Catholic Mexican immigrants and the threat of Hispanization of the southwestern regions of the United States, which according to Huntington represent the real threat to America's national identity. In a relatively failed effort to revive WASP nativism, Huntington claimed that Americans' national identity and culture were shaped apparently once and for all by the original white Anglo-Saxon Protestant settlers. In order to become assimilated, all later immigrants will need to accept and adopt the language and the main values of the WASP settlers. Huntington makes no explicit reference to race or racism in his historical reconstruction, and the few references to African Americans one finds in the text give the impression that for him blacks have become assimilated insofar as they have incorporated the language, the religion, and the values, economic, cultural, and political, of the white settlers. In any case, Huntington's dissociation of the geopolitical threats presented by Islam and the threats presented by Hispanic immigrants indicate the extent to which at the time, and I'm talking of 2011 when the book came out, the extent to which at the time geopolitical civilizational discourses and anti-immigrant nativist discourses did not converge yet. At least they did not converge to the same extent that they already did in Europe, where the contested issue of Turkey's entry into the European Union was inextricably linked with the debates about the assimilation of Muslim immigrants. Certainly, Islam and Muslim immigrants also emerged as a contested public issue in the United States after the terrorist attacks of September 11. But the anti-Muslim discourse that emerged was primarily connected with homeland security and the global war on terror, that is, with the security threats which Muslim terrorists and the states that supported them presented to national security, namely to the power of the United States abroad and to domestic security. Much more rarely was it connected either with nativist issues of immigration or with the nature of Islam as an un-American and unassimilable religion. But Trump's primarily racist anti-immigrant nativism has fused again issues of race and religion, which had always been intertwined among white evangelicals. If one adds the defense of traditional Christian values against the gender revolution, one can see how issues of race, religion, and gender are likely to remain intertwined in future contestations of American civil religion. What Abraham Lincoln anticipated as a horror, the notion of a know-nothing president in the White House, obviously has become, to a certain extent, a reality.
Literally.
What nobody, and here I finish, what nobody could anticipate was the election of an American president whose populist, nativist, geopolitical slogans, America first and make America great again, were tied to an attempt to dismantle the entire international system which the US had constructed and led in World War II, and with a proposal to return to a mercantilist struggle among nations, now on a global level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Rhys Williams, and the title of his talk is Religious Populism in America and the Possibility for Democratic Politics.
Thanks. I used to be quite opposed to using PowerPoint. My line was, power tends to corrupt and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But you can show images, and I'm particularly fond of showing images. So I'm going to start off with a few here and hope that these help to illustrate some of the points I'm making today. One trait, I should also mention that I'm delighted to be on a panel with Jose and Rogers, and thank Jean for the invitation. I think we'll find a lot of overlap in what we're saying today. One trait that American religion and American politics share is, I'm going to argue, a populist tendency. The American religious landscape is filled with groups founded and led by people with little formal training or institutional pedigree. They felt directly inspired by the Spirit, right, and they endeavored to live out their calling. American politics, similarly, is full of people, often including, perhaps especially including, elected officials, who have little training or experience in policy or governance. Indeed, having no background in political life is often considered an electoral asset, right, as one is untainted by a career in politics. Campaign literature from school board elections to federal offices regularly tout candidates' family life, the church they belong to, the other signs of success in their life, how long they've lived in their community, as most important qualifications, often not mentioning that they've ever held office before. And often activist citizens, people getting involved in politics for the first time or early, will narrate their awakening with the language of the conversion narrative. I was blind, but now I see. Something happened and the scales fell from my eyes and I had to get involved. Right? In a sense, of course, democracy itself is a certain form of populism, predicated on the fact that people should be directly participate in governing themselves, they're capable of making such decisions, and that it's normatively correct and just for them to do so. The people, which is the central, if underdefined, category of populist thinking, is also the central actors in democratic theory. In the liberal democratic nation state, of course, particularly in the 20th century, populism has increasingly been understood as a particular type of political discourse or style of politics. But even so, I'm going to argue it aligns with American religious and political culture. So today I'm going to discuss what I think are the important features of American religious populism, grounding them in American religious history, and then illustrating their relevance to political populism. Doing so, I hope to show that the populist impulse should not be conceded to the right wing, right? Even though it's clear that conservative Christian mobilizing over the last 30 years has taken great advantage of it. And the current presidential administration sort of goes without saying. But nonetheless, the seeds of a mostly democratic, truly democratic, and progressive populism that promotes equality and social inclusion is possible. And I'm going to draw on my own and others' research to show what I think, how religion can play an essential role in such a movement. In fact, I would argue that it must play an essential role in such a movement if the left is really interested in a truly multicultural and multi-religious, multi-ethnic left. Communities of color and religious minorities, many of whom are immigrant communities, religion is often central to their lives, and a truly inclusive left must take that into account. All right, so I'm going to argue, I'll start with talking about American religion. Right, the theological traditions of populism, of Protestantism, came to colonial America early, of course, with Anglo-Saxon settlers, and then flourished in the organization of the social field that we now call religion. Right? It's abetted by legal disestablishment. It's become culturally normative, even in those traditions to which it's not indigenous. One of the pressures that newer and non-Protestant groups, in fact, regularly experience in the United States is have to accommodate or adapt to the populist characteristics of Protestantism that I lay out here. Several different macro narratives about American religion. Often, almost all of them, contain a central importance of the individual conscience. There are many different versions of American individualism, but they show that top-down control of religious practices and ideas have been fleeting in American history. Occasionally, of course, there are concerns about authoritarian groups and practices such as mind control or brainwashing, but I would argue that just merely shows, right, that those normatively reinforce the basic assumptions about the importance of individual autonomy and choice. And often, of course, those concerns about authoritarian groups have just been excuses for marginalizing and even on occasion destroying groups that are seen as threat to dominant social orders. But the decentralization of American religion, abetted the importance of individual conscience, can be traced to the early colonial period. Tellingly, even the most controlling of religious establishments in the United States, the Puritan Calvinists of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, could only imperfectly enforce doctrinal unity or even who counts for church membership. Rhys Williams' Baptist tendencies were exiled to Rhode Island. Annie Hutchins was banished for her antinomianism in the late 1630s, and some Quakers were in fact even hanged. But even within the Calvinist fold, the shift toward a religious individualism and an emphasis on autonomy was occurring. Out on the western frontier, which at that time was Northampton, Massachusetts, Solomon Stoddard and his grandson, Jonathan Edwards, right, were running a very different type of Calvinist church. They were preaching and emphasizing the extent to which individual commitment rather than formal sanction was the key to faith. The so-called New Lights of that time embraced revivalism and an experiential and emotional approach to faith, resulting in what often gets called the First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 40s. George Whitefield later brought Methodist enthusiasm and a dynamic preaching style to New England in the 1740s and 50s. He often did not have an assigned pulpit, right? And when he didn't, he would preach outside in parks and fields. He was known for doing that. In fact, you can see in some of these images, these are George Whitefield doing this, literally taking religion out of the church. Now, revivalism in the 18th century is generally thought to have increased church attendance, and often people were founding new congregations. It wasn't necessarily anti-organizational. But even in these new organizations, church fathers had increasingly less control over who preached and what they preached. The role of the laity was enhanced. Personal experience, and in particular, the emotional presence of the Spirit, moved the masses at the expense of learned theology. Not necessarily a revolt against Calvinism at that time, but it was an attempt to revive it, to prevent declension. Right? They demonstrated and legitimated a clear pattern of operating outside established ecclesiastical institutional channels and claimed a religious authority that was in large part based on their connection to the people. Now, these early populist tendencies were further accentuated in the early national period, the first quarter of the 19th century. Immigration, and actually as Jose was mentioning, immigration began to increase during that period, largely from Scot-Irish and English working classes, who instead of being Calvinists in the same way often had pietist backgrounds. Right? They were Methodists, they were Baptists, and other what were known as nonconformist sects on the British island. As Nathan Hatch has persuasively demonstrated, this period marked a clear what he calls democratization of American Christianity, meaning specifically Protestantism. Right? The frontier could not be supervised or monitored by coastal elites. Right? It was consistently moving westward. Laity were expanding geographically, but also numerically, faster than religious institutions could provide trained clergy. So a populist religious leadership emerged. As Hatch says, quote, authority depended not on education, status, ordination, or state support, but on the ability to move people and retain their confidence. Right? A typical type of clergy at this point was the circuit rider, an itinerant preacher who rode territories rather than filled pulpits, shared the gospel wherever they could get people to gather together. Most had no formal training. Their main qualification was being on fire for the Lord. In fact, many were close to illiterate, their ever-present Bibles notwithstanding. All right? The populist religious leader was distinctly Protestant, but it wasn't denominational in any particular way. Francis Asbury of the Methodists, William Miller of the Adventist tradition, Alexander Campbell, who founded Disciples of Christ, even Joseph Smith of the Latter-day Saints could all be described this way. Religious authority was devolving from institutional hierarchies to popular sentiment, to local communities, to individual consciences. Hatch astutely observes this represented not just a contestation over theology, but, quote, a passionate social struggle with power and authority. Now, a lot of this happened close to 300 years ago. I recognize, 200 years ago even. But I consider it formative, and it remains relevant, I think. It set the terms with which much of American religious practice and religious authority has been addressed ever since then. Peter Williams' History of Popular Religion, or Catherine Albanese History of Nature Religion in America, show the extra-institutional religious impulse that has existed outside of the control of elites in some measure through much of American history. What the Second Great Awakening and the early national period did was push this into the mainstream of American religious practice and made it a standard, even default assumption. But lest I think this about only, or lest you think I only want to talk about Protestants, another example is the struggle over the Americanism controversy in the Roman Catholic Church in the 19th century. All right? Many American Catholics, both clergy and laity, argued at the time that the church needed to accommodate the particular social conditions of the U.S. So, for example, they looked very approvingly on the legal separation of church and state because they saw it as protection from Protestant majorities. Right? But Rome continued to condemn that separation even up until the First Vatican Council in 1870. Americanism recognized the importance of the laity in the life and work of the church, something, again, not fully embraced by Rome until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. All right? The tendency toward congregationalism and local practice, the importance of individual conscience, and a basic comfort with American popular culture became ever more important for Catholics in this country, and particularly since Vatican II. So this populist impulse had organization as well as theological dimensions. The congregation, which I just mentioned, which sociologists tend to define as local face-to-face gatherings, regular gatherings of co-religionists, became the sine qua non of American religious organization. Right? De Tocqueville famously called the congregation the first institution of American politics. And many Protestants understood this as a seamless blending of religious and national identity. Right? In fact, they were thought to be self-organizing, self-governing, local, and voluntary, the institutional logic of popular authority. Especially in the 20th century, even Roman Catholic parishes began to adopt and be influenced by this organizational style. Ethno-national parishes, right, geographically defined parishes began to recede. Catholics increasingly often rely on what sociologist Tricia Colleen Bruce has dubbed personal parishes, right? Protests against the ecclesiastical reassignment of either popular or unpopular priests have increased and become increasingly common among Catholics. Sociologist Gene Burns documented the increasing discretion that many Catholics use in deciding which of the church's teachings are particularly relevant to them. And this became accelerated after the ban on artificial conception in 1968. Right? So many Catholics act on their own personal authority, even as they may be informed by the church. Increases in immigration to this country since the 1970s is increasing both in numbers and in religious diversity. For the first time, really large numbers of non-Christian groups, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. What sociologist R. Stephen Warner has called de facto congregationalism can be seen in these examples as well. Right? Two features of these adaptations are relevant here that I want to mention. First, the development of temples or houses of worship, right? Mosques, temples, however they are termed, into congregations that act as community centers, right? And social services, as well as places for religious rites. And then the consistent pattern of second-generation Americans in these traditions to work to separate religion, what they considered mandatory, that they want to understand to be faithful, from what they call culture, which largely, of course, means their parents' culture. And this can be reevaluated, right? It can be adapted or perhaps even discarded. In research that I've done with second-generation Hindu and Muslim college-age youth, they consistently use phrases for this consideration of, well, I did some research, or I choose this. They report on numerous conversations with peers as they develop a collective identity that some of my students refer to as being third culture kids, not their parents and not their peers either. But they're appropriating discretionary authority to decide what is religion and what is culture. In many cases, these young adults start their own organizations, what one referred to me as a para-mosque organization that they organize and run, right, distinct from established masjids and often engaged in community organizing. The legal structure of religion in the United States accommodates this, right? The legal disestablishment of the federal government, which eventually led to the legal disestablishment of the colonies, has produced an institutional field that has relatively low barriers to entry, all right? Varying degrees of state control on some things, but there's no inherent political control on founding new religious groups, all right? This has often meant that expertise, institutional credentials, and sanction are not only not necessary to begin your own religious group, but can be suspect. All right? We have something of what might be called an open market in religion, with ordinary people fulfilling their own spiritual lives in ways that has further democratized religious practice. This was particularly true, of course, on the frontier, and one reason the frontier was particularly important is its site as the source in cultural mythology of true Americans, and many of our admirable qualities of starting over, being industrious, courting adventure, and making one's own way in the world. All right? Now, along with these features, it's important to realize that religious authority not just came from people, but that people could make these decisions on their own, and they could get it from, for example, Scripture, right? The Protestant principle of sola scriptura, by Scripture alone do you get religious authority, right? But it could be read directly and unmediated by institutional elites in order to gain its truth, a type of what's been called Scottish common sense realism, facilitated an unproblematic, lay-driven reading of the text. Generally, the Bible just means what it says, and when such meanings are unclear, they can be discerned through the heart. Right? The passion for Jesus that has been the mark of evangelical Protestantism. Well, there we go. All right, let's go back to pictures. I like those better. Well, maybe I can't go back to pictures. This is why I don't do PowerPoint enough. All right, of course, the struggle with power of authority, as I mentioned, didn't end with the Second Great Awakening, right? Even into the 20th century, where Robert Wuthnow documents the decline in denominationalism, right? This is a rejection of distant authority. Philip Hammond has called this the third disestablishment. First, the legal disestablishment in the Constitution, the second being the displacement of Protestantism from cultural hegemony after World War II, and now the continuing replacement of institutional authority with personal autonomy. From cafeteria Catholics to spiritual but not religious. Religious authority continues to devolve and decentralize. Finally, I want to mention that along with the idea of individual conscience and experiential personal authority, right, is a distinct localism in Protestantism. This too is deeply built into America's religious and political culture. Right? Barry Allen Shane's work demonstrates that even in the colonial period, what was often articulated as individual was an intense communalism, but at the local level. The fear of tyranny was from distant hierarchies. And this was true whether those hierarchies were monarchs or whether they were ecclesiastical hierarchies. Right? And of course, some of that suspicion was mutually reinforcing, right? And led to much of the suspicion of Catholic and Catholic religious hierarchies that Jose was mentioning earlier. One of the reasons Catholics were thought that perhaps they would not be able to be good Americans. They didn't read the Bible on their own, said nativists. They didn't choose their own congregations, and they obeyed leaders, who often were foreigners, about how to vote. So the American solution was localism, a moral community dedicated to preserving a public good and a willingness to abridge individual prerogatives, if necessary, but only if the disciplining authority was local, and thus individuals were capable of participating in the establishing the political order. Right? Local control was then both politically palatable, but also religiously correct. It also had an advantage religiously of putting some parameters on scriptural interpretation. So if everybody was reading scripture and deciding on their own, how do you keep error from spreading? Well, it gets based in local communities, often with a charismatic leader, which could be also read as an authoritarian leader, to keep some readings out of it. All right, local communities continue to dominate in both religious and politics much American cultural mythology. Whether it's the famous Mayberry of the Andy Griffith Show, right? The Boston Bar of TV's comedy Cheers, right? You want to go where everyone knows your name. Journalistic odes to local, to the local and the familiar, Tracy Kidder's Hometown, or Ray Suarez's This Old Neighborhood, right? It continues to be a major theme in American life. So I've outlined these three themes about American populism, right? And want to talk now a little bit more directly about political populism, right? Which I think, as several of us have mentioned, and you will continue to hear over the next day or so, these are clearly resonant, right? The idea that the people can make decisions for themselves, and the people do not necessarily need an elite. The Manichaean us versus them logic that, of course, was built deeply into Calvinist theology between the saved and the unregenerate. And it is true that among pietist Protestants, the kingdom of heaven is at least in potentially open to everyone, right, through declaration, being born again, conversion. But in some ways, that only served to make those who haven't made that decision all the more accountable for it, right? The general will, directly available, potentially unmediated to the people as a critique and a resource. Leadership that may be charismatic in the Weberian sense, right, or authoritarian, but very direct, with some perceived as local and connected to the people. Now, Michael Kazin makes the important point, right, in his book on populist persuasion, that the populist claim is that powers are transgressing, of inequality, but that the powers that be are transgressing the nation's founding creed. So the populists were affirming, not denying, the nation's basic cultural and political worthiness, right? The debate was about who could truly represent the essential American vision of what a good society looked like. Norman Pollock noted that 19th century populism had a legitimacy derived from association with the nation's first principles. And in other writings, I've talked about the civil religious discourse that animated 19th century populism. How am I doing on time here, Gene? Sure, all right. So,
5 minutes.
okay, sounds right. The localist orientation then can clearly be seen in recent protests and organizing on the right. Right-wing militias such as the Posse Comitatus organized on the principle that no government and no law enforcement agency beyond the county level is legitimate. All right. In the summer of 2014, Nevada rancher Cleveland Bundy had on his ranch an armed standoff with agents of the federal government, and during that time he said he didn't recognize the authority of the United States to govern the land on which he was grazing his cattle. He didn't recognize any authority past the state line of Nevada. Now, the multiple pictures of him carrying an American flag as he rode his horse went unexplained, but nonetheless, it was a clear point about the nation and the American nation being distinct from the state, at least the federal state. The point is a certain localism is built deeply into political legitimacy in American politics, and it has the affinity to the populism in American religion. Now I want to turn to what I think might be the possibility, as I said in my title, for a different democratic populist politics, democratic with a small d. Right? In many ways, populism has been conceded to the right. I don't think it has to be that way. Whether the 19th century Americans were a grassroots social gospel or a prophetic civil religion, right, I think it can be again. Now, Laura Grattan's recent historical work compares several examples of radical grassroots democracy in which the people are trying to reclaim a type of power versus the elite. She doesn't mention religion in her work, but she's unwilling to concede populism to the right. She does note that when discussing Occupy, right, and credits it with a populist critique of neoliberalism, but that one of the reasons it failed its inclusion is that Occupy either could not or would not reach out to local religious congregations and faith-based organizations in communities of color that were already doing certain types of occupying work. Now, as I noted before, I have a certain amount of self-interest in making this claim, right? With two colleagues, we just put out Religion and Progressive Activism, New Stories About Faith and Politics, New York University Press, with a nice blurb from E.J. Dionne, so I know he will recommend it as much as I do. I'm hoping he will recommend it as much as I do. But many of the stories we have in here are about intensely local examples of political organizing, right, with progressive religion. And they're also examples of thoroughly multicultural, multi-religious, and often multiracial coalitions doing this. Right. Just to name a few of the examples from this various research, so that I preserve some time here. So for example, Ruth Braunstein has done some recent comparative ethnography with both some Tea Party organizers and Interfaith, which she calls a community organizing coalition sponsor that is connected with PICO, right? The Tea Party group, of course, uses populist and civil religious themes regularly. So do Interfaith. They're quite explicit, excuse me, quite explicit about their religious impulses and motivations, and they've developed elaborate procedures of meeting and decision-making to try to make that inclusion actually equitable. Mia Diaz-Edelman, another colleague who has done work with an immigrant rights coalition in California, uses the term a multicultural activist etiquette to talk about internal relationships, allowing people who are unsure about political involvement and insecure about calling attention to themselves in public to find a voice and a setting. Jennifer Cosa-Leon, who happens to be a doctoral student in my department, is doing ethnographic work on 2 coalitions in the Chicago area, mix of African American and Latinx recent immigrants, one dealing with family issues, one trying to secure social and political rights for the formerly incarcerated. In all of these cases, right, there's a clear attempt at internal relationship building and internal empowerment that is meant to not just stop there, not just stop with feeling good, but understands that transforming the local is a step towards transforming larger structures. Right? It's also worth noting, right? They're deeply connected to the religious traditions of communities of color and immigrant groups, and that is part of their strength. So my conclusion then, the populist imaginary has been and should be a useful resource for progressives. My argument's correct. The key is not to hide the progressive label or to retreat from religious stories and identities. Rather, it's to use the founding images that are built into cultural themes and that celebrate everyday people, including religious people, as heirs to a country of opportunity and equality and inclusion. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So our last presentation on this panel is by Roger Smith, and it is, the title is Populism and Progressivism in American Stories of Peoplehood.
Thank you. It's an honor to be part of this conference and on this panel with 2 such distinguished sociologists of religion. The minority status of my discipline, political science, on this panel and in this conference is, it's worth noting, no accident. When I began graduate school more than 40 years ago, neither populism nor especially religion were considered very worthy of study by serious contemporary political scientists. But the rise of the religious right and of Islamic terrorism put religion onto political science research agendas, and today political scientists in every subfield are studying the populisms that are surging on seemingly every continent around the globe, as Jean noted. This conference and panel are still particularly timely and important because that new scholarly attention to populism often employs definitions of the term that give relatively little attention to populism's relationship to religion. The argument I want to make here today is first, that populism requires a narrative valorizing the goodness of the people that is often supplied by religious accounts, especially in America. Second, that the stories that work best to mobilize populist activism, whether religious or secular, are in a certain sense progressive, in that they include an account of how the populist movement will bring the people to a better state on an enduring basis. And third, that in America today, the most highly mobilized forms of populism are more on the right than on the left, because contemporary liberals and those further left are wary, in my view, understandably but unduly wary, both of religious narratives and of any and all narratives that promise such enduring progress toward a better condition for the people. Let me start by noting that much attention has recently been given to the political theorist Jan Werner Muller's book, What is Populism? And Muller has argued, somewhat like Jean did in her opening, that populism is a, quote, moralized form of anti-pluralism, so inherently illiberal, given to internal authoritarianism and allegiance to a leader believed to embody popular will. And Muller is typical in not exploring the links between that moralization of anti-pluralism and religion to any great extent. Muller acknowledges, moreover, that his definition does not work well for the late 19th century American People's Party and attendant movements that are the primary American examples of populism, because those movements were largely internally democratic. They did accept the results of electoral processes, and they did not follow any authoritarian leader. So, though Muller's analysis may be useful for thinking about modern European populisms, it has limited value for our topic here, populism and religion in America. Perhaps the most influential political scientist writing on populism is Casanova, who has long argued for what he terms a minimal definition of populism as a, quote, thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two separate and homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. But others, including Georgios Katzimbekis, argue that even this minimal definition goes too far, because the people in populist movements need not be conceived of as homogeneous. All that is required for a view or movement to be populist is the insistence, first, that politics is fundamentally about the clashes between the people and the elite, and second, that virtue and legitimacy are all on the side of the people, whoever they may be. Now, in many respects, I favor these minimalist definitions of populism, which allow us to recognize populisms that have both right-leaning and left-leaning economic agendas, and which also permit us to deem parties and movements that are internally democratic and that do not follow an authoritarian leader to be populist, as Muller's definition really doesn't. But all these definitions, including these minimal definitions, still tend to bury a feature of populism that our topic requires us to highlight. Both logically and politically, populist movements must have some account of why we should deem the people pure, virtuous, the source of all legitimate power, and the elite corrupt, vicious, illegitimate. Populists must have what I've called in my framework for analyzing what I term stories of political peoplehood. Populists must have in those stories an ethically constitutive theme, an account of why the people are so good. These accounts need not be religious. The people can be declared virtuous by many standards, including their industriousness and productivity, their patriotism, their culture, their honesty and goodwill toward others, and more. But to make any logical sense and to have any wide political appeal, populisms must have some story of how and why the people are intrinsically better than the elites who oppress them. In American populist movements, indeed in America as a whole, those stories, those ethically constitutive themes, to use my jargon, have been overwhelmingly, though far from exclusively, religious. The People's Party platform and the populist speeches of the 1880s and 1890s never failed to invoke Almighty God and usually to claim that the plain people who made up the movement were God's chosen people, as Jefferson had suggested long ago in his notes on the state of Virginia. It is in fact because so many populists in the 1890s were imbued with a religious sense of their identities, their virtues, and their oppression, that they could be inspired to rapturous support for the boy orator of the Platte, William Jennings Bryan, when his Cross of Gold speech took the Democratic Convention by storm in 1896 and propelled him to the first of his 3 runs for the presidency, first as the fusion Democratic People's Party candidate. And in an era then when the split between more theologically liberal and conservative Protestants was far less than it would become during the 20th century, and at a time when those religious differences were not yet aligned with partisan allegiances, it was not difficult for much of the sense of religious fervor and purpose visible in many populists to be channeled into the social gospel movements that helped fuel progressivism in the early 20th century. Just as the progressives could and did adopt many of the policy positions of the populists, and just as Bryan could and did become the progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. That social gospel religiosity, in turn, blended over time with the black church social justice traditions that helped mobilize the grassroots aspects of the 20th century American civil rights movement. All these examples fused religion with populism long before the rise of the modern religious right. In analyzing American stories of political peoplehood, including those favored by late 19th century populists and their successors, I have argued, along with Maral Ugur-Shinar, that they tend to have a kind of teleological organicist structure in which the nation's narrative is portrayed as tending, perhaps inevitably, but not inevitably, but still predictably, to bring the American people to some higher and better state. Probably the most frequent and widely embraced forms of those organicist theological narratives historically in the United States have been providentialist religious ones. From John Winthrop's City on a Hill through the intimations of America's place in God's plans and Tom Paine's Common Sense to the manifest destiny doctrines of the Jacksonian Democrats to the claims for America's new global role in Josiah Strong's Our Country and the speeches of Albert Beveridge, all the way up to George W. Bush's proclamation of America's divine mission to spread liberty around the world. American leaders have won popular support, and they have both reflected and reinforced populist movements and political parties by articulating beliefs that Americans have a special providential role that will lead ultimately to their permanently enjoying greater glory and happiness, perhaps shared with all mankind, at least by example. And now, as Rhys noted, the sociologist Ruth Bronstein has recently been undertaking ethnographic studies of both right-leaning and left-leaning grassroots populist groups in America, as reported in her book, Prophets and Patriots, and subsequent papers. And she has recently turned also to analysis of the stories of American peoplehood deployed by leaders seeking to win support of those groups as well as others. She's noted that these stories of peoplehood can be constructed in more cyclical or more linear terms, and that either structure can be used to advance an account that culminates in enduring progress for the people, the American people. Cyclical stories can be tales of declension from an earlier golden era, followed by a decline, but then leading to an ultimate return to golden times. And such accounts often resonate with religious narratives like Christian accounts of humanity as having fallen from a state of grace that will, in the future, somehow be restored by Christ's second coming. Linear narratives can be providentialist religious narratives of fulfilling God's plans, but they can also be secular narratives that are tales of struggles leading ultimately to lasting progress, like Marxist accounts of class conflicts culminating in an egalitarian communist society sometime in the future, or like even earlier Enlightenment historical narratives of the gradual triumph of reason in guiding human life. Bronstein argues overall that both right and left-leaning grassroots movements today embrace senses of themselves despite having different stories of American peoplehood in various respects. They, in common, embrace senses of themselves as virtuous democratic citizens seeking to mobilize people to achieve some such higher end state in the future. An end state sometimes understood in religious terms, sometimes in secular terms, sometimes conceived in cyclical forms, and sometimes in linear ones. And she contends that in 2016, Donald Trump advanced what was for many a compelling cyclical narrative. America was great, America fell into carnage, and Trump's People's Movement will make America great again. That's the cycle, including greatness through restoration of religion to a special place in American life. And Bronstein argues Hillary Clinton, in contrast, did not advance any clear narrative of how the people would progress in either religious or secular terms. She tended instead to advance a long list of policies that did promise to make many Americans better off, but they were not placed within a clear, compelling, overarching story of why the American people were good or a potent image of the better condition that we are seeking to achieve. I largely agree with Bronstein's analysis, and I want to add to it here some arguments about why Clinton and many other liberals and many further left often fail to advance persuasive stories of the goodness and future well-being of the American people, and so they leave populist movements to the proponents of conservative, indeed literally reactionary narratives like Trump's story of making America great again. The fundamental problem is that for good reasons, many modern liberals and leftists have lost faith in narratives of progress, whether cyclical or linear, and even more, they see these narratives as all too prone to be justifications for many forms of oppression that should be resisted. Enlightenment tales of the triumph of reason are rightly seen as historically linked to, if not indeed responsible for, Western imperialism, racism, sexism, economic exploitation, and repression of diversity in many forms. Marxist accounts of dialectical historical struggles are seen as utopian in their hopes at best, as intellectually and politically discredited by the fall of communism, and as justifications for totalitarianism at worst, so that even class-focused left populists like Bernie Sanders shy away from invoking them. Barack Obama did, on occasion, endorse black church social justice teleological views, such as that articulated by Martin Luther King, holding that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And Obama also often evoked Abraham Lincoln's contention that the purpose of America was to achieve gradually over time the meaningful enjoyment of the inalienable rights with which the Creator has endowed all people according to the Declaration of Independence. But Obama was wary of being identified too strongly with either black social movements or religion, fearing that these identifications would limit his ability to lead all Americans. So he most often muted these themes, especially while in office, instead of articulating them in ways that could might help build an enduring coalition. Now, all these concerns about progressive narratives are, I want to stress, reasonable, and they do not by themselves prevent those who are left of center from being ardent small d Democrats who might therefore seem to have some hope of inspiring a left-leaning Democratic populism. And I don't think that that kind of inspiration without any sort of progressive narrative is impossible, but I do think it is made much more difficult politically and in fact logically by the absence of any strong account of democratic progress. In this regard, let me note, contemporary academic democratic theorists are not a lot of help. Some emphasize democratic deliberation, as Obama often did, but these counts today often seem all too academic and naive in an era of political polarization and echo chamber opinion formation so sharp as to make genuine deliberation seem virtually impossible. Accounts of democracy as fundamentally about anti-domination, as in the work of Philip Pettit and Ian Shapiro, or agonistic, as in the works of Bonnie Hogan, Chantal Mouffe, and others, or democracy understood as a fugitive phenomenon that erupts periodically, as in the work of Sheldon Wolin. All these accounts often convey the impression that at most, small d Democrats are engaged in a cyclical story of oppression and resistance with occasional uprisings, but little hope for enduring improvement in the state of the democratic people. And that's especially true of the more radical versions of contemporary democratic theory. And when we look at contemporary political movements inspired in part by theories of radical democracy like Occupy Wall Street and, at least in some variants, Black Lives Matters, we see more of an emphasis on achieving spectacles of inspiring resistance than we do on mobilizations guided by a vision that promises to achieve over time enduring democratic progress and improvement in the condition of the people as a whole. When we do see contemporary left-leaning populist movements that strongly promise lasting progress, as in the left populisms of Latin America, many of those often prove to rely on the charismatic claims of authoritarian leaders like the late Hugo Chavez in the manner that Jan Werner Müller fears. As a result, the shared commitment to democracy that Ruth Bronstein finds in grassroots activists today is not something that can easily be mobilized by liberals and those further left for a progressive politics and a progressive populism. So, in closing, let me say that I believe those of us who do not wish to repudiate all forms of populism or leave populism to the right are well advised to think again and to think anew about what kinds of narratives, secular and religious, might credibly offer roads to lasting progress for the people. The answer, I think, is that progressives should not seek to find one single authoritative such narrative of progress to which all must subscribe. They should seek instead to build coalitions amongst all the broadly compatible versions of narratives of popular progress that we can find, all the versions that have the capacity to move different groups of people and bring them together into a common politics. Now, that's a challenging assignment, intellectually and morally, as well as politically. I've advanced some ideas elsewhere that are intended to aid thinking about what such a politics might look like, what such a story of American peoplehood might be, but I don't profess to have found the answer. I do submit, however, that if progressives remain deeply uncomfortable about promising to the American people that the American people can hope to achieve a greater good on an enduring basis, then progressives cannot be surprised when those American people deny to the gloomy progressives the political authority to try to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see. So we have around half an hour to discuss. Ask the first question and then open it up to the audience. I mean, I see there's a connecting thread in at least two of the papers. I'm not quite sure that Jose's would fit with the argument. But, you know, I want us to avoid a terminological dispute. I mean, you know, we can define populism in a million different ways, and I don't want to get into that. But what I'm one of those who thinks that, well, let's put it this way. Maybe the American populist movement of the 19th century is the outlier. I know historians insist this is populism, nothing else is populism, but, you know, the word is out there. You have Latin American populisms that don't, in retrospect, might seem economically progressive or inclusive, but they're certainly not democratic in outcome, at least. And so, I mean, politically, in terms of the constitutional democracy and those institutions, once in power, they always go after the basic institutions of constitutional democracy. And obviously what everybody calls right-wing populism in power does that too. We can distinguish between populist movements, populist parties, populists in power. But I'm not convinced that the localism or the direct democracy within religious populism or within political groups that are so-called secular is what we would want to define as democracy, because I don't think you can have a modern democracy that is not direct, that is not representative, mediated, and at least national. I'm not even sure we're there anymore. So I would agree with Rhys that there is that's why in other words, that's why the relationship between populism and democracy is so complicated. But I don't think you can have localism and participation, but be very exclusionary for those who are not part of your group and who you haven't converted. So it's not so democratic, you know, across the groups. And on the other hand, with respect to Rogers, I would say, and I'd like to hear both of the responses, I very much endorse, I think it's true we have to get back to talking about the achievements of democratic constitutionalism in America, let's say, or elsewhere, and how to make it more democratic and better. But, and I think we probably do need some utopian narratives, but I'm not convinced that these have to be religious, and I'm certainly not convinced that they should be framed as populist. So I'll leave it like that. Maybe you both want to answer, then we'll open it up.
Sure, no. They're good points, and I'm taking two things out of what you said. One is connecting what may be admirable local efforts to the translocal, and direct democracy perhaps to representative democracy. And the second is the dynamics of exclusion among groups that are self-consciously being inclusive. There's still somebody outside who's not at the table. Yeah, those are, both of those are hard ones. And part of my response is that I feel so discouraged and concerned about the attack on basic institutions of American life that we're experiencing right now, and particularly anything that any institution, whether democratic or not, that actually tries to redistribute either economically or politically or even status-wise. Exactly. You know, that one of the because they seem so firmly, in my good populist mode, they seem so firmly in control right now nationally that part of my concern is let's look local and let's see what we can do. And translating that into particularly representative forms, I think that's going to be a huge issue, and I don't have answers there. What I'm trying to look at right now are the potential for transformed lives and local communities. The one about the exclusion within processes of inclusion is another one that at some level is intractable, since every boundary, every us implies a them. You know, if you're people on the inside, there are people on the outside. I think that's the case. The autocritical and the self-consciousness with which I've seen many of these local coalitions try to deal with that strikes me as hopeful. Now, sometimes I think they're willing to be too inclusive. Sometimes they won't partner with people who are, they'll partner with everyone. Well, you don't want to partner with certain landlords, for example, right? You want the power of the state to reform their practices. So I think that has potential issues. On the other hand, the self-conscious deliberation and attempts strikes me as hopeful. So I can't dispute your point. I'm just going to say I'm hopeful on both cases.
So I'll say that I very much agree with you that wrangling over what is populism is not going to be very productive. It is probably just sensible for each of us to say what we mean in the course of a particular analysis or argument and let it go at that. In the case of this particular conference, I did feel reluctant to embrace definitions of populism that insist on the abandoning of representative institutions in terms of the power of an authoritarian leader, because in American history, that basically leaves me with populism meaning Huey Long and Donald Trump. And I want to include a lot more self-identified populist movements in America than that. But again, the definitional war is not the fight I want to have. Also, you may have noticed I hesitated a second as I was reading my resolution because I was squinting at something I had scribbled on my text. And what I had scribbled that I should have emphasized is that I am certainly not saying that the kinds of progressive narratives I'm talking about have to be religious. The scribbled part was coalitions of narratives, religious and secular. And I did emphasize that we shouldn't look for one single narrative. We should have a set of compatible narratives that share broadly some visions of better conditions for the people. And some of these may be religious and some not. I don't think that secular progressives should shun the religious as much as some have done, but I am not saying that we have to embrace religious narratives. And thank you for getting me to clarify that. And I should also clarify that although I do think that there needs to be some kind of persuasive narrative of progress to mobilize, inspire, at the same time, I'm as wary as anyone else about any kind of deterministic narrative that claims inevitability and seems to take away the contingency, the choice, and therefore ultimately the political responsibility of we the people to make it happen. I do think, though, that for the understandable reasons that I listed, many progressives are actually not articulating much of a narrative of progress at all, and I think that is a political liability and mistake. Yeah.
Very quickly, Jose, and then I want to open.
I think I emphasize on purpose nativism as a crucial aspect of American populism, because I think if we only look at the differentiation of the virtuous people against the elites, we miss the fundamental aspect of exclusion of those other ordinary people who do not belong. And this has been crucial in the formation of American populism. Perhaps not always, but certainly in the present. I mean, the reaction to Obama was build a wall. Nobody reacted as much and became so enthusiastic about, to Trump that built the wall. It is the anti-immigrant nativism, and it is the anti-Muslim nativism. To any notion that it is only against the elites, I think is short-sighted. And this is the point I wanted to make, that American populism is intimately linked to those religions which are truly American versus those which are not, before Catholicism, Mormonism, now Islam, and to those groups who are not, do not belong, and should not be here. Blacks should not be here, Native Americans should not be here, and a lot of other races should not be here. And if we don't take this seriously, we are simply not looking at reality. I'm sorry.
I'm all in favor of taking those things seriously, Jose, and I have spent a lot of time attending to them over the years. The only thing I would disagree in that characterization, I would not deny that nativism and racism are fundamental and central features of American political culture that are constant dangers. But I want to be able to call Bernie Sanders a populist.
Why? I mean,
And,
well,
I don't think he's the same kind of anti-immigrant nativism.
Okay, I want to open this up, although I don't know why we have to call Bernie Sanders a populist. I would not, but that's another debate. Okay. Camilla. Oh, wait. So 1, 2, 3. All right.
So as I said to Jose in the past, I think in your presentation you mentioned populism once, only at the end. You will talk about nativism, and I agree, as Roger was saying, this nativism is part of American culture, political culture. But as I see it, it's coming from Latin America, and even as Jean says that the Populist Party was an outlier, because compared to the Latin American governments, because here there was never a populist government, and we don't know how a populist
Now.
government in the U.S. would have governed.
We see.
Not for me a populist government in which we are today, because it has nothing to do with the agenda of the populists in America in the 1860s and 1890s. In a way, as I see it, populism is against nativism in a way. They cannot be together. They're two different phenomena. If you go to Latin America and you talk about populism, nobody will tell you that populists are racists. This is another feature. One is exclusive and the other is inclusionary. This is one thing. And the other is that the emphasis on religion, I think it's very interesting, but to basically claim that the populist party at the beginning was, religion was kind of a necessary condition or is inherent to populism, I would say it's a little bit confusing because America was a religious nation. So in a way, how could a populist movement be non-religious?
Right.
So, and Jason is very keen in saying this was a populist rhetoric. It was the preacher way of kind of evangelizing because of socioeconomic conditions. But it was not religion per se. Because if you embrace religion, then you're excluding other religions that are not American religions and
Wait,
you're going
wait,
back to the West. So you're going back to nativism. So what is
That's
the
his
word
point.
that populism is making there? If you just talk about
Okay,
nativism,
please, we need okay. What time is it? Maybe I'll collect 2 questions at a time now. So, yes, in the back.
Well, first of all, I consider.
But these,
All right,
I hope these are questions.
Yeah, don't worry. Well, people are coming. This is very hot stuff to talk about. To me, the Academy for 50 years has not examined these issues critically. That's why we're in this situation right now intellectually. If you go back to populism, George Wallace's movement was populist.
Obviously.
That was the populism of the 60s that we now are living with politically today. And I was laughing when someone mentioned Occupy twice. I mentioned in Occupy down there in Zuccotti Park once, you guys should run for election. I was laughed out of the park. So remember, we're dealing with anarchists. And the question I have to you is, let's look at Trump's coalition. We know it's fragmented. Where's the interrelationship of eschatological Protestantism, which is what in part has led to his election and reinforces his ability to stay in power? How can we fragment out his electoral basis, which is not just that 40% after he made those outrageous comments coming down the Trump Tower, but a lot of other fragments? Where can we see this intersection of religion and politics that we can then strip away from them down the road?
Okay. Anybody want to answer any of these questions?
Again, I'm not sure about, my interest is not developing a theory of populism. And I'm not trying to say that Latin American populism, this is what we have studied for 30 years, is the same thing that North American populism. My point is to understand the contemporary reality and the triumph of Trump without looking at this interrelation of race, gender, language, anti-religion, and the anti-Muslim, the anti-Mexican, and the anti-gender, and anti-black. Without these, you cannot understand, I think, the victory of Trump. It may not help us to develop a theory of populism, but it's not my interest.
And I have to say that I'm afraid I can't agree that populism is simply opposed to nativism. Populism requires some account of who the people are, and often in America, they have been nativistic accounts. That's just absolutely true. There's also been different accounts, and so I don't want to say it has to be, but I also don't want to say it's opposed. I do think that the Trump coalition was built by offering a story of a vision to make America great again, and that meant different things to different people. Some, it meant make it a Christian nation again. Some, it meant make it a white-ruled and male-ruled nation again. It had different meanings. That's the way coalitions are built, by different groups finding common cause in a vision put forward for them. Trump did that with enough success to squeak through the election, and so it's a powerful position worth taking seriously. I also think that counter coalitions can and must be built.
Yeah, I would just say just one comment on that. I mean, let's not forget he did not win the popular vote. And much as I agree that we need stories of, we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater regarding progress just because we know the underside and all this other stuff, and achievements, although we know the underside. But from my perspective, one of the problems with the concept, and I really do insist on coming up with a concept, an ideal type of populism, is precisely that you have to say who the people are. That's the problem. I don't think in a real democratic dynamic, the issue should be who the people are. That to me takes us down the wrong road. I think the issue should be what all of us, or many of us, or most of us, what are the norms and values that we should support, and what are the democratic principles, et cetera, and how can we get public policy that is constructive. I think if you go down the road of who the people are, you're going to go down the road of exclusion. But I had questions. I had Vicky and I'm blocking your name. Yes, Vicky, and then I have to come over here. I know.
Hi. Well, first of all, Rogers, I'm glad you discovered populism and religion. I think comparative politics had been studying it since I was in grad school, which is a little bit later. But
What's that field again?
yeah, I know, that's exactly the point. So, so one of the things that of your story of progressives without progress is that it seems to me that the narrative of the Democratic Party is the narrative of diversity, which is quite cacophonic, but in part is the narrative of diversity because what diversity means is taking out, the things that's on top of people and letting everybody have the same opportunity, but there is really something that from a comparative politics is strange, the kind of fear of use the word equality. Egalitarianism is what's behind diversity. But for some reason in the American context, you cannot use the words. That's the context of Latin American populism. They had very diverse coalition, cross-class coalition, ethnically diverse coalitions, and they call it themselves as egalitarian coalitions. And so there's something else there that has to do with the American cultural context that I think is important to point out. And the second comment that, I know this is about religion, but you are all ignoring the political economy of this story. I mean, there is a reason why it's so hard to elaborate this progressive progress story, which is that we do not know exactly, at least on economic terms, how does it go? Maybe there are movements like the minimum wage or minimum income, but there's not really a clear political economy story of where we're going. So I think that in the Latin American context, the solution was not nativism, but nationalism, closed economies, anti-imperialism, that got everyone together with, and generate a series of economic challenges. I think in the US, that's the problem. There's no real political economy story.
Okay, and the second question?
Thanks. This was all very interesting. I have just a question for Rhys and for Rogers. So, on the localism of sort of religious organizations, one thing that that I'm interested in here is, through the development of the U.S. Along the frontier, a really interesting part of your story is the way that these kinds of the demand for religious services, shall we say, kind of ran ahead of religious organizations being able to fulfill them. So you had this kind of spontaneous generation of religious leaders and so forth, and they have this kind of populistic bent. Found that very interesting. The parallel, though, would also be with sort of market actors, right? You actually get small businesses that will emerge in the same kind of context. And now I kind of fast forward to the 1880s and 1890s and the embiggening of big business in the U.S. So we have organizations growing. And I just wonder whether there's any kind of parallel story about the embiggening of religious organizations, which could lead to basically fighting back against local control, basically, like in business, we get this divergence between big business and small businesses, and that coalition is often split and not always on the same page. And I wonder whether there's any kind of story about that for religious groups. For Rogers, I found this very interesting. The whole talk was fantastic. But when you say that we need a kind of a democratic, a progressive story about democratic progress, I wonder what's wrong with Obama's story. Actually, I know you mentioned him at one point in your talk, but his story, his speeches, his statesmanship was basically all based around the idea of the fulfillment of the doctrines of the founding in this diverse coalition. That this is in a way like the empowerment of this coalition is itself a sign of, and in fact an embodiment of, the progress, the fulfillment, as it were, of those principles of the Enlightenment, of the founding. And there's an agenda that goes along with that. We need to do the things that are going to help this coalition prosper that they weren't able to do under previous arrangements, and so on and so forth. And you can talk about all sorts of political economy issues that go along with that. Right. But I wonder what the issue is with that story.
Good. Okay.
The short answer is yes to the idea of the beginning, particularly of denominational structures, and particularly for mainline Protestantism, that by the 1960s, there was movement among many mainline denominational structures towards, we're going to have one big church, right? And it was bureaucrat-driven. 475 Riverside Drive, Heaven on the Hudson, was a big motive behind that, and it ran into intense opposition from locals. Now, it also got mixed up in the politics of Vietnam and the politics of the civil rights movement, but there was a reassertion of localism, and so the Presbyterians moved their headquarters to Louisville, Kentucky, and the Congregationalists moved theirs to Cleveland, and so on. That the idea that they had to be more back with the people who were supporting them, money, donations really dried up at the denominational level compared to the congregational level. Yeah, I'll leave it there, Roger.
So I can put these two questions together. I'll first say that, Vicki, you're quite right that the comparativists were doing better than the rest of the field in regard to the things I was criticizing. I think you're also right that there is a discomfort with many kinds of language of equality in American political culture. There's this fear that we will talk about equality of results, and so we only want to talk about equality of opportunity, but that's hard to achieve without moving toward greater equality of conditions, so we often prefer not to talk about equality at all, as you point out. And I think that is very much bound up with our commitments in political economy. I don't actually think it is too difficult to have a political economy policy program. I think the country clearly needs massive infrastructure investment for growth, and clearly needs health care for all. But the Democrats are reluctant to have their clear democratic plan to achieve these things, and it is because they're afraid of being thought too left, big spending, taxers, and so forth. That also means, however, that they're not sufficiently responsive to the political economic conditions that did lead many Americans to be receptive to right populist appeals. And those conditions do need to be addressed. In regard to Obama, I have two-part critique. He did tell the kind of story in both religious and secular terms that I think should be told. As I indicated, I don't think he did it as frequently and forcefully as he should because he feared political consequences. But I also think on a lot of political, the fear was that he would be seen as too black and that he would be seen as too religious by secular types. It's also true, however, that while Obama's policies were greatly preferable to what we have now, in my view, he was half-hearted in a lot of his political economy measures, too,
Yes.
and could too easily be accused of having a neoliberal agenda that did not respond to the conditions of lots of working-class Americans very effectively, as much as it did to financial and corporate elites. And it is those liabilities that I think made his story less broadly persuasive than it might have been. I will note that he got over 50% of the vote twice, though, so the story's a pretty good example.
Yeah, I would say that he was very he ran as a narrative with a progressive narrative, but he ruled without a narrative. This is the problem. The twice when he ran, he was very effective. But once in office, he basically ruled as a technocrat. Even on the whole Obamacare, not even once he used a moral argument why we should have health for all. Not even once. Purely technocratic economic arguments. You cannot build a story like that.
Okay, we have time for, your hand was up for a while, right? Okay, last question for now, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talks. It was very interesting. My name is Alexandra Tartaglia. I'm a master's student in the Global Thought Department. And my question is for the whole panel, to what extent do heroic narratives play in populist elections?
Let's start with Jose.
Heroic, you have both heroic and victims. It's victims that become heroic is the narratives that I think that work best. Somehow those that you overcome, yes. So, but again, I think we will have to go back to a specific context of, let's say, from independence to Jacksonian democracy to the Civil War, and we are entering to World War I, to World War II. So there are different moments in which this heroic story changes, but it's always related to with the people. In this respect, I think that the inaugural addresses are this part of this story. But
Anybody else?
It's regularly, in at least American populism, charismatic in the Weberian sense, right? It's infused with the idea of a special or divinely offered quality of the leader, and that puts the leader apart and separate, makes them uniquely able, as the current president said, I alone can do this. And I think that particularly on the right, there's a lot of sympathy to the idea of the single heroic individual sort of bringing order to chaos. Having to find that in a more diffused and a more egalitarian group of actors is a challenge, I think.
And I just add, I think the question is a productive one. It makes me think that it may be possible to distinguish two different kinds of populist narratives. One, which valorizes the great leader of the people as the hero who will save them, and the other, which valorizes the people themselves and say that the people are the heroes of their own story. I think the second is to be preferred.
And I'll close by saying neither nor. I don't like reifying the people. If you mean individuals, acting autonomously and then together to make progressive change, that's fine with me, but I'm very wary of the word the people. I think it's myth-making and dangerous, and I think there's a relationship between that concept and the leader, and I would have to disagree that it's just right populism. Chavez, Maduro, Perron, many left so-called because of their economic argument, but many so-called left populists in power. I mean, obviously there was the leader phenomenon, and they were not democratic. They were not Democrats once they got into power. I think this is not an accident, but we have a whole 2 days to go through this. So thank you very much for a wonderful panel. And we start again at 4 o'clock. Is there?
Yes.
Well, is there coffee?